Hello everyone, welcome to the Post Wellbeing Pod by the Wellbeing Service. My name is Ayushi and with me I have Devisha. Today we are going to talk about self-regulation. For that, we have a special guest today, Amanda Sadien, who is a neuropsychologist working with the Ministry of Health. Amanda, would you like to tell us a little bit more about yourself?
So hi, Devish and Ayushi. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. So I'm a neuropsychologist working primarily at the National AIDS Secretariat. My job mostly is directed towards people living with HIV/AIDS, providing support to their families, providing support with regards to medication, providing support in terms of their social transition. But I'm also attached to the harm reduction department that looks at addiction support. So I'm involved in methadone clinics. I'm involved in the assessments and support of a patient living with substance use disorder as well. As I usually said, we'll be talking about self-regulation today. So it's a pleasure to be here.
So to begin with, how important do you think self-regulation is in our daily lives? From a neuropsychological perspective, do you think there are functions, in the brain that are responsible for that?
Definitely. So if I have to answer the question straight away, it's really, really important. But I feel like before moving to the importance of self-regulation, it's important for us actually to know what we mean by self-regulation. How do we define it? So I think it's if you look at the literature, it's quite new research while being old research at the same time. So the term itself was coined in the 80s when it comes to learning. And you have the term becoming more and more popular in the past 5 years. With a rise in self-care, the ability to control our thoughts, the ability to have to grasp more control on our emotions. So when we look at self-regulation, I'd say if you could close your eyes and imagine yourself in a world where procrastination was a thing of the past, or where binge eating or binge watching shows on Netflix would be something of the past, and you'll be very, very ahead of your game, doing your work, being really, really attentive in class, and doing things that are on your to-do list and not just pushing them away. When you look at self-regulation in the context of today's talk, I'll be mostly looking and focusing on emotional self-regulation, which is often termed as just emotional regulation. When you think of it, go back to this idea of a big Shaolin master with an ability to deflect emotion and have some sort of an emotional empathic shield that allows them to actually process emotion from a reactive point of view to a responsive point of view. So you move from something that is an immediate a direct thought process to something that's mostly thought about a reaction. So when we talk of emotional regulation, I'm mostly focusing on these. If you were to tell me about the neurological aspects of it, I'd say that look at the limbic system. There is no one big path for self-regulation because it connects to different areas of the brain. So the limbic system surrounds this idea of emotion regulating, homeostasis, being able to find that right balance, having that idea of emotional processing as well. So there's the amygdala involved. So there are all links to different areas. When you talk of motivation, it's rooted there as well. So, but the core idea of regulation is that, again, that thought process, so the lengthy process. So it would definitely go to the idea of using our prefrontal cortex. That would look at mostly executive functioning. That would be looking at this idea of reacting with regards to cues from the environment as well, having that ability to, instead of having that reactivity, but processing it with regards to what is expected of us, what would be the desired response or desired outcome in that moment, and using that thought system, that thought process, to get ahead of our game, as I said earlier, so to reach our goals eventually. So make something direct and sometimes a bit more expressive and meaningless into something useful and powerful. So that's where we're actually headed when it comes to emotional regulation.
So, how important of a skill do you think self-regulation is for students?
Yeah, so when we talk of students, so remember we say that the term was coined in the 80s, and there were a lot of researchers looking at this concept. And the idea is that we mostly talked of it as self-regulated learning. It's no longer has to do with just core emotions, but it looks at the learning process as well. So if we were to look at it at different phases, you'll have the ability to assess, so to evaluate your emotions independently of the environment. Just assess yourself as honestly as possible, and actually look at how you're feeling. So that could be anxiety. And then it moves to something, is this anxiety important? Is this anxiety helpful? Because we tend to coin terms as being negative or positive. So emotions are valenced, and they have some sort of size or amplitude added to that. So it's either positive or negative, it's high arousal or low arousal. But we have that tendency to categorize these. So anxiety, bad, fear, bad. But when you look at regulation, it's actually using that anxiety. So at times, anxiety is not that bad. So having an anxiety just before a podcast might be scary, might actually not help you say whatever you plan to say. But then you move to something where anxiety and that whole physical process with the adrenaline rush, with the cortisol response, with the alertness, where it becomes important. So, if, for example, if you're face to face with a ravenous hyena, well, you need that flight response. You need the anxiety to activate that flight response. So, you have sort of an importance to this anxiety there. So, when it comes to learning as well, this anxiety can be important. So, without that little rush, you wouldn't actually do your homework, or you wouldn't actually complete that assignment like at 5 a.m. just before submitting it. So I know as students, we are masters in procrastination. We keep pushing things. But the ability to self-regulate is that at one moment we just snap and we have to get things done. I think we'll talk a bit more on procrastination later on, but it's the idea that this skill is increasingly important, not just for students. Long time back, when we think of students, we think of graduates, university students, going for primary school, secondary school, and then tertiary level, and that'll be it. But we are in a more and more competitive world where even a degree is not enough. Where there is that idea of lifelong learning, when there is that idea of being constantly asked to do more, to be better, to be able to survive in that arena. So it's the idea that going beyond that and driving yourself for self-learning, regulating yourself for doing a course online to learn new skills, or learn something else for a side hustle, actually helps you. So when it comes to this lifelong learning process, you won't have teachers behind you pushing you. Going to university again, it's about mentoring adults and teaching them how to be independent in their learning. It's no longer, parrot learning from a book that would be, assessed just in an exam. It's about developing thinkers, developing humans. And as they grow, they will have to keep thinking and keep moving through that process of learning. So it's the idea that the earlier you develop that skill for self-regulation, the better off you'll be career-wise, the better off you'll be as a human, the better off you'll be in your couple, the better off you'll be in your life in general. So that skill if you look at it, you asked me a question how important it is for students to have. I'd say it's important skill for anyone to have, really, especially for students in these times. We're still in the COVID period, in the COVID pandemic, where students had to learn online. While this can be a useful tool for self-regulation when it comes to social media, keeping in touch with your friends, in terms of this ability to discuss, in terms of this ability to form bonds and idea and have this sort of map present there that can help you to self-regulate. While this can be useful for self-regulation, this could be like some sort of double-edged sword when it comes to actually delegating your work to later and pushing it away and doing more fun things while you're supposed to be processing and doing work. So it's just striking that right balance between what is needed and what is expected. So I mentioned the different phases, and I think we'll talk about it a bit later on, but the different phases basically moves through the assessment process, evaluation process, and the actually sitting down and doing thing, processing the emotion and actually doing the thing that is required of you, that would be beneficial for you in the long run. And then keep on reevaluating yourself and reassessing yourself as you go along, as you move through that cycle in a way.
So according to you, not being self-regulated, what can it cost us?
It's really hard to always be ahead of a game and, always assessing us. At times we just want to relax and watch Netflix. At times we just need a break. At times we just want to do things that make us happy. So it's hard to actually find the right balance and the right middle when it comes to that. So in terms of course, remember that as humans, as adults, as people living in the social world, we are constantly exposed to potentially arousing stimulus. So it could be that when you're driving and then someone just honks at you and they're very rude to you, and that annoys you and you feel really, really bad about it. Or it could just be that you work so hard for an assignment and then you don't get the grade that you were expecting. Or it could be that you really, 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 really want something, but you cannot afford it for the moment. So there are some different aspects of our life that actually cause these uncontrolled arousal that actually drives these emotional, these intimate feelings that come forward instead of that actual processing. So it's really hard when it comes to that. And we coin that term emotional dysregulation. So you have someone go through a big outburst and be really, 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 really mad at people and not being in control. You'll have individuals in their couple, for example, in terms of cost, it could cost you in your sex life as well. It could cost you in terms of your ability to move forward at university as well. So if after first assignment, you just give up and you're really, really annoyed and you just don't want to go through this same path of putting in the efforts and sacrificing some of your work, well, you'll end up actually lagging behind because opportunities are there. There are other events that will come in and propose you that event again, where you might actually have another reaction this time, or you might have another sort of feedback this time. So that is if we look at people in the general spectrum speaking. And now you have other issues as well that may arise from there. So an inability in having that self-control or self-regulation could be in binge eating during exam periods, or binge eating and developing some sort of eating disorders after some times, or driving into the drive-thrus of McDonald's when you're stressed at work. There are so many things that we do at times just to be able to cope, but this is coping. It's like putting a plaster on a huge huge volcano that's about to explode. That won't help you. So it's the same thing as a teacher going back home from work and thinking, oh, that day was horrible. It could be from issues that we've had with our colleagues. It could be that I'm not understood by my students. It could be that, well, I'm not paid enough for the load of work that I'm doing. There's so many things that could put the pressure on you. And you end up going back home and you're like, I'll have a huge glass of wine, those big 1 liter glasses of wine. And I'll just binge watch Netflix and enjoy myself and sleep at 3 a.m. Well, that's fine if you were to do that. It's a mental health break. If you were to do that once in a while, that's not too bad. Kind of self-care. What if you were to do that every day? What if you were to do that 5 times a week? Would you be able to achieve your potential? Would you be able to reach wherever you wanted to reach? How about the next day when you go back to work? Would that solve the issues? So it's about this idea of regulation does not mean coping. Because at times we do cope, but for a short term, we look at the instant gratification. That's why I mentioned earlier, there are links to motivation. There are links to the reward pathways, because we look at the instant relief, the thing that would allow us to take a big breath and be, I'm fine. But what's next? So self-regulation is just one step up. So you'll see a lot of people developing substance use disorder linked to bad coping strategies, alcohol issues. You'll have people being actually driven by psychiatric medicines. You'll have people developing eating pathologies, as I said, might develop depression, might develop anxiety when they are faced with the actual triggering event. Now, moving to the idea of there are people who have these issues from a head start. So there are people who were born with developmental issues, such as ADHD, such as ASD, and emotional dysregulation forms part of their disorder, forms part of their condition, forms part of their daily living. So if these kids are not given support at an early age, what will happen to them? So what's the cost to their lives? So these kids will not be able to self-regulate once they actually move into a career path. These kids won't be able to self-regulate in their relationship as a couple. These kids will not be able to self-regulate as adults in society. These kids might not be able to self-regulate when they are angry. So as a kid throwing a tantrum in a supermarket, that's one thing. A 35-year-old male throwing a tantrum on the supermarket store, that's a bit different. So it's this idea that early support when it comes to self-regulation helps us reduce the cost in the long run. So when you think of it, I'd say for typical adults as well, when it comes to the university system, it's the idea of having a tip that could be used to be able to successfully cope would be having like 2 breaks or 2 mental health breaks. I mentioned that earlier as the example of a teacher per semester. So it's you quantifying them. So if I have just 2 dates where I could sit down and relax and have my wine and watch Netflix, well, I have to choose them wisely. So during a full 3 months or a full 4 months, I have to pick just 2 dates. So I have to be able to regulate myself the other days and push through my work the other days and enjoy these 2 days of relaxation. So it's having that balance in that idea. So yeah, poor self-regulation have costs, whether cognitively, whether financially, whether in your social life, whether in your personal life, whether in your couple life, at work, well, all-encompassing issue. And that's why it's becoming more and more popular to talk about it.
For a moment, I started self-reflection there, but
That's fine. That's fine. That's what school is about, actually.
yeah. So, following what you just said, I realized that self-regulation is very hard. Like, it's really difficult. So, what do you think some are the challenges that people come across while trying to achieve it?
I think it's just the idea of, having that pause. We are running through life. We have so much things to do, so much responsibilities, that where will I have time to sit and reflect and actually think about every single decision I make in my life? So that's where things become hard. And it becomes even harder when we actually wait for huge events to happen and think, oh, I need to learn how to self-regulate. It's an actual habit that we have to keep driving. It's an actual habit that we have to start very small. And that's why I say that the earlier you start it, the better you'll be. So whenever there is a sort of a big event or an impactful emotional event, you'll be trained to be able to reflect on that, and it'll be much quicker. So it's like learning a new skill. So if you were to learn French, for example, it'd be very hard for you at the beginning, but eventually, the more you practice, the more you're exposed to it, the more you find tips, the more you're exposed to I say native fluent speakers, well, the better you'll be at it eventually, because you'll find connections. You'll find, oh, I can do that. Oh, this is easy. Oh, this is not as hard. So you'll find ways and you'll find tips to go along your way. So I grew up watching Cookie Monster, Sesame Street, and I absolutely adored that character. But if you were to ask me, he was like one of the most less self-regulated individual in all of Sesame Street. So he'd find Cookie and be like, oh, nom 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 cookies, and that'll be his whole storyline, literally not being able to avoid cookies. And at times we find ourselves in that spot where we can't actually stop ourselves from binge watching TV or from, as we mentioned, procrastinating, because procrastination in itself is a whole talk of its own, with the anxiety and these issues linked to it. But at times it becomes a habit for us to keep pushing. So this idea of self-regulation is that instead of keeping on pushing, and you find yourself with like a bucket load of things to do, and you're overwhelmed, and you need a break to be able to deal with that overload. And once you're done with that break, you have more overload. It's about dealing with things as you go along. So the challenge is actually sitting down and dealing with it. And it is hard, as you said, Ayushi. It's very hard, but it's just doing things. It's just the idea of take time at the start, and then you go along to change it. Okay?
Yeah. So, from your story of the Cookie Monster, it just another question just came into my mind, and I couldn't stop but ask, do you think media has an influence on how our idea of self-regulation is today? Because I'll talk for myself. As the youth, I really depend on what the media is telling me. If today someone's doing something, I want to do that. And tomorrow, if that has not worked out for them, then I'll be like, okay, this is not going to work. So do you think it has like a positive or a negative effect on our effort of trying to self-regulate?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question. Going back to Cookie Monster example, 5 years ago, there was some sort of study, and Sesame Street has been trying to tackle these issues openly. So this idea of tackling unseen issues at start, and Cookie Monster is the perfect character for self-regulation. So 5 years ago, they started changing his character to someone who could actually self-regulate. So now Cookie Monster knows how to breathe and do belly breathing, and he's one that actually knows how to think about, smelly fish instead of thinking of cookies. He knows how to divert his mind. So Cookie Monster evolved accordingly. So they trained him to have that skill. And mind you, Cookie Monster is around 43 years old. If a 43 years old puppet can do it, why can't we? So it's the idea that exposition to that would actually change. So you mentioned media, and they did a study with, again, Sesame Street study. I think it was funded, or it was supported by the channel. And they had preschoolers do a study before watching Sesame Street and after, with Cookie Monster regulation tips, self-regulation tips. And prior to that, they were exposed and presented with like the favorite treats, and they were asked to take them if they wanted, or have some sort of control. And post Sesame Street, these kids had 4 seconds more to actually think about. So there were like a bit of processing done before actually picking that favorite treat. So even if it's a little thing, it's still something, right? So when you look at shows today as well, they have a lot of tips going along. So if you talk of TikTok, it's not only showing people dancing or doing things, or showing cute pets on TikTok. There are other things as well. There are actual talks, there are topics, there are podcasts as we're having today. It's just about picking the right one for you. So exposition to that can have a positive and a negative impact, but it depends on where you're headed and where your attention is geared at. So when you think of you mentioned a few videos or a few shows out here and some sort of trends that are happening. Well, it depends on you. It depends on what your end goal is. So the big question is, will it actually help me reach my end goal? Because the people showing skills or showing trends on YouTube, whatever they are doing is bringing them to the end goal, making money and being influencers. But will that actually help us? So it's just asking yourself that question.
Earlier, you mentioned finding cues in your environment or around you to kind of support regulating yourself over time. What exactly did you mean by that? And if you had examples, maybe to help us kind of apply that to our own lives.
Okay, so there's some sort of misconception going around in self-regulation. So it's the idea of doing good or being well or doing like whatever is expected of you. So finding cues in the environment is not really relevant to that. It's mostly finding cues in the environment in different contexts, because self-regulation exists not in isolation, but it exists in our social self, it exists in our career-driven self, it exists in our goal-driven self. So it's just finding elements in your environment that support that stimulus, that primary stimulus that drives. For example, if you were a kid studying for their finals, they had to actually notice, well, I've studied for, let's say, 7 days a week, haven't had any breaks, have done all my homework, haven't had any interaction, left my phone on the side and focus on my exams. But at the end of the day, they didn't get results they needed. So cues from the environment would be, well, whatever you did, there was something wrong in it. That's not your end goal. So what can you do to improve that? It could be that as a human, you need balance. Maybe you need some time off. Maybe you need to focus on your learning process. Maybe the way you're learning is not actually beneficial to you. Maybe you're someone more visual. Maybe you're someone that needs some sort of rehearsal. Maybe you're someone that needs examples. So you focus on that. When I mean cues from the environment, it's the actual reevaluation, because you can't actually expect that through some sort of cognitive regulation would actually bring you to always some sort of one-size-fits-all answer. It's about looking at the environment and altering it. It's like what I think of when I mention self-regulation is like, you know, the Nest thermostat that you have at home. So you have to regulate it to find it's like a small device at home that keeps your house all at the same temperature. And why do you need it? You need it for things around to be functional. You need it to be able to be functional yourself. So regulating things around and finding the right, you know, value, and by turning the knobs in terms of increasing the volume or decreasing the volume would actually help you find that right balance. So it's a bit of test and trial, but you'll be able to find that right balance until you reach whatever goal you have. So I'm not too sure if I answered your question there.
You did. If I understood correctly, it would be tuning into what is being asked from you from that situation and kind of
Exactly.
decide what regulation means for that particular event. Yeah.
Exactly. So it's important to know that at times we think of self-regulation practices. Oh, if I'm self-regulated, I'll never be sad in my life. I'll never be anxious in my life. I'll never be angry in my life. But that's not the case. As I mentioned, you can't expect or can't aspire to be always happy. That's not part of what it means to be human. We have a whole range of emotions that we have to go through them. So whenever we're sad, we have to accept and acknowledge that we're sad. But what can I do with that sadness? Right? So it's tuning in into whatever emotions you're feeling and not, putting it aside. No, I need to be happy. No, I need to be strong. I need to cope. I need to forget about this anger and keep at it. It's just using whatever emotion there is as a driving force in a way. So you regulate yourself to be able to move forward.
With your experience with working with substance misuse cases or addiction issues, and we're talking about self-regulation here, so how would you say those two kind of go hand in hand together?
So as I mentioned, addiction issues can come as a consequence of poor self-regulation. So, for example, people living with ADHD, if they're not self-regulated, tend to develop addiction issues in the long run. People with learning disabilities as well, if they're not self-regulated, tend to turn to substances or to alcohol. But then again, you have actual core substance use disorder that links to poor regulation and lack of control over that, thinking process. So it's mostly reactive. I'm angered. I'll take some drugs. I need some time off. I'll take some drugs. I don't want to act aggressively because I'm angry and I know I'm going to hit a wall. I'm going to hit my family. I'll take some drugs. I need some time off to enjoy myself or leisure time. I'll take some drugs. So I move towards that immediate process of it being the only solution to my problems. I need to move towards it when I need to enjoy my life a bit more in terms of pleasurable activities. So when earlier we talked about brain systems involved, we talked about the limbic system, and we talked about how it actually relates to the reward pathway and the reward system. So addiction issues looks at immediate gratification. I don't know if you remember, you're both from a psychology background, the marshmallow study they did on kids some time back. So they would give like a marshmallow to a kid and present it and be like, that looks really nice, like that fluffy little cloud. But don't eat it. I'll be right back and I'll give you 2 marshmallows if you wait for it. And kids with poor self-regulation would just go for it. And kids with more sort of an ability to regulate would actually be waiting. They would use strategies to actually think of it as being in a frame, or the marshmallow being something plastic, or the marshmallow being some sort of a toy, and have some sort of conversation with the marshmallow. There'll be like all sorts of strategies that kids would use their imagination for. A few years into that, we have adults, but except the marshmallow is now drugs. So for them, it's instead of waiting until I go to my doctor's appointment, I'll just take, a little dose and be off, and I'll be fine until today. And tomorrow I'll take another dose and I'll be fine. And the day after tomorrow, I take another dose and I'll be fine. So that creates some sort of issues. And in terms of drug use disorder, substance use disorder, we just have to tread on we're trying a fine line here, because there is also so much more about addiction that's not self-regulation, right? There is part of which the individual has some sort of control over. So the motivation, the ability to control the behavior, the ability to think, cognitive reprocessing of some sort of stimulus in the environment, peers walking by with while they're smoking, family issues. Those are the triggers. But to be able to cognitively reprocess that's in terms of control. But there's also that physical issue that's present. So long-term substance use actually creates some sort of impairment in terms of brain function as well. So they will need time to heal physically as well. So it's not just looking at that cognitive reassessment and being able to self-regulate, but it's also giving their brain times to heal. So that's why it goes hand in hand with treatment, with psychiatric treatment as well. So when you talk of substance use disorder, it's just, again, finding that give and take. So you have to find some ways to showcase that long-term achievements have more value. Long-term achievements bring you more validation. Long-term achievements bring you, some sort of self-esteem, boost your self-efficacy, boost your self-esteem. And there is that last aspect. I mentioned self-efficacy. It's the idea that what I'm doing will actually make a change. So at times we're like, okay, but if I do that, will actually change my life? If I self-regulate, how will it actually change my life? I don't have control on people's reaction. I don't have control on my grades. I don't have control on how my brain is. So it's the idea of people scoring high on self-efficacy scores. So knowing that they have an ability to make a change will actually feel more, confident in their ability to make that change over the long run, and be more motivated to make that change, and be motivated to keep that change until they reach their end goal. So there's a lot of connection there. So it's not just talking about self-regulation as being the one main driver in addiction studies. There's so much more. And we're talking about substance use, but there's also gambling disorder. There's also alcohol issues. Often we have that idea that substance use is for a specific category. And there is some sense in that in terms of society as well. So addiction has that impact in society where people have no training for life skills, have no training for self-regulation, because that's not what's important. But there is also that issue that, there are some old grandmas who are addicted to gambling as well. So they are not put in the same basket, but it's still an addiction issue, right? There is still poor self-regulation. Mm-hmm. So I think we have to look at it from like a global perspective. Mm-hmm. It affects all of us in a way, but it's not just the main driving force. There are so many things alongside. So for the old grandma, it could be that she's lonely. There are so many things involved. But yeah.
Thank you. That was very insightful to distinguish, between the various factors that could affect someone's struggles, and we cannot just attribute it to just one.
So I hear you mentioning that poor self-regulation can result to substance use disorder or gambling or, addictions. But like, for example, someone has gotten it now, like someone has entered the pool of addiction. Do you use self-regulation to remove them?
From an addiction?
Yeah.
Okay. In a way, it forms part of the therapy. So you have cognitive behavioral therapy, you have DBT, you have cognitive reprocessing, you have mindfulness-based therapy. They are all linked at giving tools, right? Finding that toolbox, and self-regulation forms part of that toolbox. So I think we all have heard of deep breathing, 478, the 448. There's so many different types of deep breathing techniques. You have this idea of there's a fun thing that we do as well is for younger generations. What will my superhero do? Or what will my idol do? It actually helps because you ask a kid, what would Batman do in that time? And they would actually pick what Batman would do, and they would pick the actual desired response. Mm-hmm. And for the most part, you would train them in sort of a lab setting, but in a clinic in terms of therapy with scenarios. And when they're presented with that, it's easier for them because they've been trained and they've sort of strengthened that connection. So we're born with like trillions of neurons, but the connections, we make them, right? We make them from practice. We make them from our experience. We make them from reinforcing them. So yeah, self-regulation forms part of a treatment. But again, it's not the whole story. There's so much more, but it does form part of a treatment for an addiction. It would be part of a treatment for crimes as well, for someone who's violent, or someone who's a perpetrator of child abuse, who's a perpetrator of domestic violence. It would be the same mostly.
Makes sense.
Or knackered in the next morning, and you left the exam room not knowing whatever you've written because you've forgotten everything, because everything that's been blocked into your short-term memory. So next year, when you start the semester, it's like a blank slate, and you have to start over again. And it's really, really, really difficult. So it's the idea that, procrastination is not the enemy, but you work with it. So if you keep pushing, at times you have to ask yourself, why do I keep pushing? What's the reason behind? There's no behavior with that reason, right? So is it because I have some insecurities that I won't be good enough despite all the efforts I've been putting in? Is it because, I've never really taken responsibility for my own things? So back in high school, I would copy homework, or I would have like help from other people, or my mom would write my essays, things like that. Well, when you grow up, you end up being insecure about your own ability, right? You'll be like, how do I do that? And then it keeps pushing you away from actually doing things in your own right. So even if it means that you won't get like such a huge score, you'll still get a score, and you still have that self-satisfaction of having done things. Even if you have not managed to write the whole thing, at least you submitted it. So it's just little goals, little chunk, bite-sized pieces. So when it comes to procrastination, break the whole goal idea into small items that you can actually achieve, and give yourself, I know when you say give yourself deadlines, you'll be able to do it. Well, it doesn't really work. So instead of giving yourself deadlines, have a talk with a lecturer or a supervisor, or even your mental health counselor, and tell them, in 2 weeks' time, I have some sort of assignment I have due, but I would like me to come see you, and we can discuss whatever I've done during that stage. So you'll be forced to do some work before you meet that lecturer. You'll be forced to do some work before you actually meet your supervisor. And you plan these as some sort of milestones so you can progress. I think that's the main part when it comes to procrastination. But an elemental part of it is again, self-evaluation, being self-aware and being able to reevaluate, because your first plan might not always work. There are ways that, you might be planning and doing things in the right way, but then it doesn't actually bring you to the end goal. So just reprocess and start over. Reprocess and look where you've reached. So it's not about, starting from a blank slate. You have information, you've enriched that toolbox. Okay, breathing doesn't help me, push that aside, let me try something else. So you've actually ticked something out of that list. So move to something else. You're still advancing, you're still progressing.
Thank you. That was helpful. I surely put it into action.
That's the most difficult part.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Amanda, for coming today. And, my take-home message for this would be, whenever those bad emotions are good, and whenever those bad emotions come, it doesn't mean that we have to completely avoid them, but rather take them as cues, as important driving forces, maybe, to kind of make us do the work, to actually sit.
Exactly.
We're guilty because we didn't finish our work. We actually use that guilt maybe to finish it on time the next time. So I guess I'll be using that, because we all procrastinate, or have difficulty self-regulating in various areas of our lives. So thank you for the enriching knowledge that you gave us today, and the little tips and examples as well.
Okay, so it was nice talking to you.
For me, there's one thing that really hit me, the part where you said that anxiety does not really have to be negative.
Yeah.
I never thought of it like that, honestly. I always just, this is a bad thing. These are just, then it just, the way you said that anxiety, for example, when you have a hyena in front of you and you have the flight or fight response activated due to anxiety, it's a good thing. So I think at the end of the day, it's all upon us how we use the what we are feeling or
Mhm.
what's surrounding us, the environment, to use to help ourselves and to get work done at least.
Exactly.
Yeah, so adding on to what Devisha said, it's really important to use what we think is a negative emotion to make it into a positive, and at the end of the day, it will be our own profit.
Exactly, exactly. So use it to your advantage,
Mhm.
because sometimes anxiety comes from sort of perfection. You know, you want to be everything to be perfect, and you want everything to be in the right way. But you never achieve that perfection because you never put pen to paper, right? And it feeds into the anxiety and becomes more horrible, and you don't never want to turn the laptop on. So, but actually using that anxiety to drive that force and polish yourself, you would actually realize that you're actually sharpening certain skills, and you'll get back into getting better and better and better and better until the anxiety itself just comes as a driver, just comes as something natural that you can actually process easily. So yeah, at times it's good as you mentioned that we can actually do our self-assessment. There are all things that I forgot to mention is that there are studies as well looking at, say, yoga, looking at learning martial arts or learning another language. I know you're learning French, Ayushi. These actually help you build skills for self-resilience, for self-regulation as well, in a way that actually helps you to go forward with that plan. So it's opening Duolingo and doing that thing they ask you to do every day, build on that resilience, build on that regulation, because you don't want to do it and you're probably having fun with your friends, but you just open your phone for 5 minutes and you just do it. And I think that's really helpful. And these are little things that you can add. But yeah, learning a language, that's a fantastic thing. Learning an instrument is a fantastic thing because you have to drive yourself to do that. And it actually forms some sort of parallel to your work and to your career path. It's not just having a great career, but it's also being able to have a stable and sort of happy life. And self-regulation helps you find that balance. So yeah, I hope that helped.
A lot.
And yeah.
Thank you for those wise words. We surely will take heed of them and apply them to our daily lives. Thank you, Amanda.
Hey guys! The Wellbeing Service is launching a new method to help students raise awareness on well-being. You can send us your questions as well as suggestions just by clicking the link in the description box below. The link will also be available on all our social media platforms. Your questions shall be answered at the end of every podcast episode. If you find yourself unable to cope and need support, the Wellbeing Service at Middlesex, Mauritius can help you. Contact us at counseling@mdx.ac.mu for any queries. Thank you.